All right, I see a lot of people get this wrong. I was at the gym the other day. I feel like I've had this conversation 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And a lot of times, what I see is people get very confused and they get in their heads when a rate's going to drop, where all these decisions and they're trying to do all this mental calculus on when to buy a house and does it make sense and is the market going to crash. And I think all of that can be a huge, just monstrous waste of mental space. It's sort of like the people that will spend 10, 15 hours listening to political podcasts when at the end of the day they have like a vote and the conversations they have with their neighbor. And probably actually if they spent more time focusing on like how they treated their family and how they did or did not cut people off on the highway or getting involved with their local PTA, that probably have far more influence on their life. So let me break this down stupid simple, because I feel like 99% of the buyers that are out there looking at making a purchase, especially first-time home buyers, are way too into their heads. And I'm going to make it so that you basically can play the real estate game and never go wrong. Real life is kind of like this. Everything is a trade-off of risk and reward, and everybody's trying to allocate resources and make good decisions. So let's figure out, how do we play the real estate game and make a good decision? So you have to forgive me because I'm a little bit of a nerd. Matter of fact, I just finished putting together my Transformers Lego kit. I'm working on a Star Wars one here as we speak. All right, so, and the reason I was bringing that up is for a long time I played this game called Settlers of Catan. Settlers of Catan has these little hexes, and you put it together, and it's a race for resources. There's several different ways to win. But within this world of Settlers of Catan, you have a way to win, okay? There are a set of rules, and if you play within the rules, you play within the medium that is designed, or maybe if you want to get into the nerd talk of game theory, once you understand the game theory of Settlers of Catan, the better chances you have of winning, okay? The more complex the games, the more they potentially have different avenues of winning or ways to kind of sneak around and win, but we're going to kind of focus on one aspect of this game. In Settlers of Catan, you put your towns, and you can upgrade these to cities later, at the intersections, okay? And when you play these, you put it at the intersections, basically every time a dice is rolled or a set of dice is rolled, you have this opportunity to get resources. There are 5 different resources. Now, if you understand that within a set of rolling of dice, there is a bell curve of probabilities that can come out, okay? The most highly possible roll that can happen is a 7, a 1 and a 6, a 6 and a 1, 2, 5, 5, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, and you have 6 possible combinations out of all of the combinations that could potentially be rolled to end up being a 7. 7 is where the robber goes. We'll go into the reason about that, but to get resources, effectively 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 allow you to get resources. Okay, there are 5 possible combinations for 6 and 8, 4 for 5 and 9, 3 for 4 and 10, 3 and 2 for basically 3, and obviously only 1 for 12, which is 2 6s, and 2 would be a 1 and a 1. Okay, so this is the bell curve of what can be rolled, right? Once we understand that, we know that the probability, and we won't get too nerdy into like calculating what the probability of all 3 of these is, but effectively we know that the highest probability to win or get resources would be to get the 6, 8, and the 9, right? Okay, so if we play within the set of rules, if we understand that, we can increase the chances that if we play Settlers of Catan 100 times, the chances are that we're going to win it a lot of the times. Not every time, because they're different. It's a little more complex than that, right? But you start with the basics and you get more complex. So real estate really is no different, okay? I'm going to kind of make it very, very simple here. Buy real estate well within your budget for a long period of time and own it for as long as you possibly can, okay? What we're looking for is a minimum of 5 years, right? If you can go to these online calculators, there's plenty of them out there. New York Times has one. I think Michael Blue Jay is probably one of the favorites that I've seen that's out there. And you can get really in the weeds about, what's the difference between the equivalent of a house that you would rent versus one that you would buy. But what we're looking for is, at some point it makes more sense to buy than it does to rent, okay? Ramit Sethi, I Will Teach You to Be Rich, tends to only focus on the numbers only, because there are reasons. The reality is there are freaking reasons to buy a house that don't necessarily make ROI sense. It's a return on life, right? They don't want to be told that they can't have a pit bull. They don't want to be told that they can have their mother-in-law in town for a month without getting permission, or maybe do want that. But that's the reality, is that there are emotional decisions, there are reasons outside of ROI to make home purchasing decisions. But really, if we're going to play this game long term, what we want to understand is the basics, right? So I have this, I call this the duckbill effect. I'm a terrible artist, so give me some leeway here, but I have 0 to 30 years, right? The basics is that we buy a house and we make payments over time, right? So as we make payments, and what you'll see is if you look at what's called a loan amortization schedule, over a longer period of time, more and more and more of that payment goes towards the principal versus the interest, right? The lower the interest rate, the more expeditious that tends to happen. But even today at 7%, or even if you have, let's just say at 8% locked in because you bought at the peak of a couple, this last year, you can still understand that you pay more interest at the beginning versus principal. But this accelerates over time. And if you refinance, obviously you start this clock over and you're paying as little as possible. So you want to be careful and be strategic about the refinances. That's something that a good loan officer can do, and Rachel can talk to you about that. But once you understand that this part of the lower part of the duckbill exists, and that the kind of a similar concept is with appreciation, the value of the home, right? And the reason I have this initial gap is because obviously you typically have a down payment, and so you automatically have a gap. If it's 0, then it starts together closer. If it's a larger down payment, it starts with a bigger gap here. But as you play this game, this gap gets longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. Now, obviously, we're, for the most part, buying homes with 15 or 30-year mortgages that are on them, right? But it doesn't always serve you for that long of a period of time. Maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years, maybe 7 years, maybe 10 years, or maybe you get into your forever home, or you call it your forever home, and you actually do stay in it for 10, 15, or even 20 years or longer. Previous house that I was in, our neighbors had been there for 40 years. So there are examples of that existing. And the average tenure within the state of Virginia, I think Hampton Roads is 13.7 years. It's slightly lower in the overall state of Virginia. Okay, but this exists. This is how this works. So the longer we can play this game, the bigger and bigger and bigger the gap gets. Now, if we understand that the longer we play, the better we typically do, we want to make sure that we own the real estate for as long as humanly possible. Now, I understand the arguments of not being a landlord, but if you can buy a bread and butter property, and bread and butter tends to be properties that are 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 4-2s, those types of things that are right there in the middle, right? If you look at the median family income of an area and what people tend to be able to afford for rents, that should be your first home, right? Now, I've had a neurosurgeon that bought a house, his very, very first home, first-time home buyer, 0% down for a physician's loan was $1.6 million, okay? Those exist, but that's an anomaly. I did have a couple buying their very first home. One was a dentist, one was a PT, $650,000. These are not necessarily everyday, and we had this conversation because they initially started looking at $300,000 to potentially $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 houses, and they edged up their budget more and more and more because we had this discussion of like, am I making solely a ROI decision, or is ROL kind of creeping in there, right? We can still potentially hold on to this property for a long period of time. The area that they bought in was kind of had an accelerated appreciation market, and the rents were pretty daggone close to what they would probably cover in their mortgage. And in 5 or 6 years, when they were looking at moving out of that house, the likelihood is that inflation is going to continue forever and always be a thing, and the rents would probably be able to cover the mortgage, especially since as rates are falling over the high likelihood that they're going to fall over a long period of time, is that they'll be able to refinance and reposition themselves in the market. Okay, so we have this time, and the longer we can play this, the better, right? So your first, second, third, fourth, maybe fifth home, really your first through third, especially if you're young, especially if you're looking at your first house, should be something that you can hold on to for a long period of time. Maybe you can house huck. Like I have a couple of clients that have bought a house and got tenants in, and then the very next year use the excess income they had from roommates to buy their very next property. Pedro, I'm looking at you. Okay, so playing the time. You want to be well within your budget, especially if you're single. But even if you're married, what if you have a kid and one person has to come home? What if someone gets sick? What if you get injured? There are all these kind of variables that go into it because you don't want to be house poor. The problem that most people get into is they get into Lambo freaking territory. And we'll get there here in a second. But another basic concept that we understand in winning long term, when we are looking at how do we win the real estate game, 99% of people aren't freaking getting this, so let's drive this home. PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. Okay, this is the basics of the mortgage. Most people are buying a fixed rate mortgage. Now, if you've done this a couple times, maybe I'm going over something you already understand, but it's good to get, what's it called? Repetition is the mother of learning. We're repeating, right? Principal and interest on a fixed rate stays the same. Okay? The other part of that equation, taxes and insurance, can change over time. Well, why could that possibly change over time? Mainly because inflation, right? What does taxes pay for? Pays for the police, pays for education, pays for the roads. Now, you may make arguments that they don't do a good job of that anyway, but hey, you don't really get a choice. You have something you have to pay. Okay, well, the police, the guys that are repairing the road, the materials to repair the road, all increase over time, okay? And insurance, what is insurance replacing, right? Insurance, when something breaks, a roof gets ripped off, that has to get replaced by a laborer and the materials to replace the freaking thing. Okay, so inflation can affect that piece. But the big part of the deal here is principal and interest. You're borrowing on today's dollars and paying them with tomorrow's dollars. And if inflation continues to go, which, look, whether you like that we're on the Federal Reserve System and got off the gold standard, you're not going to change that. These are things that we can or cannot impact. You're not going to change that system, right? But you're going to continue to pay on to these dollars moving forward. These dollars, but borrowed here. This is an incredibly powerful concept. Like when you talk about somebody who's lived in their house for 10, 15 years, 20 years, and you hear about what their mortgage payment is, that's why this concept works. It's very, very simple, okay? So that's fixed. This adjusts over time. And the big reason why people want to hold on to those 2 or 3% interest rates is because a large portion of that payment goes towards the principal and a much smaller goes towards interest. That's for another video, okay? And then you go, well, Dan, what about condos or HOAs? Okay, right, fine. Some payment goes towards something that doesn't necessarily contribute to your equity. But guess what? It still gets affected by inflation, right? So there are reasons to get into condos. Now, why do I have a big Lambo here crossed out, okay? And if you are young, this happens a lot with young military guys, right? They'll go out and they'll spend a ridiculous, they'll share a room with their buddy, they're paying $300-400 a month in rent, but they got this big BH bill, and so they're gonna spend, oh, I got a $1,200 payment, I can go get the blank S-Class lease or a big fucking lifted truck or something along those lines, right? Until you have the ability to go out, buy a brand new Lambo and drive it off the lot and potentially lose out, like if it gets in a wreck, and then you don't have that gap insurance, until you have that money to go, it's just not that big a deal, and people that can afford that don't tend to do those types of things, you shouldn't be buying Lambos, right? Until you get to a point where you can buy the 5, the 6, the 7, 800,000 or $1 million home and it not be that big of a deal if there is potentially a market correction. Because go back to one of the conversations we had at the gym, and it was like, well, Dan, what if the market corrects 10 or 15 or even 30%? I go, cool, you've owned your previous home, right? You've gone from $350,000 to $500,000 in value. If you correct, you're still good. You're still looking at within the time period that you actually owned that house to be above average appreciation for the last 75 years. You're still in a good position, right? So play this game as long as humanly possible. The way you do it is you buy homes that are in decent areas with decently low crime in an area potentially, maybe a good rule of thumb would be, would you want your daughter freaking living there? If not, maybe you shouldn't be buying a house there, okay? And so this is the concept. This is the idea that unless you understand these basic concepts of what it means to own a house and own it for a long period of time, and that this is what creates long-term wealth, when you can actually own these things and hand them down to your kids, then when you've got baller freaking money, then you can go make the baller freaking purchase, all right? That is what most people don't understand about the real estate market.